You came into this video feeling far from God. You came with questions, with doubt, with the pain of silence, with the confusion of unanswered prayers, with the exhaustion of waiting. And now, as you look back at everything we've covered, the silence is a sign, God working in the mundane, the community of doubters, your growing faith, the unexpected answers, your transformation, God's gentle whispers, the new person you've become, you finally see it. This was all part of God's perfect plan. This is the 12th and final sign. And it's the one that changes how you see everything. Listen to what Paul wrote in Romans 8 verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Not in some things, not in the good things, but in all things. The silence, part of God's plan. The unanswered prayers, part of God's plan. The distance you felt, part of God's plan. The transformation, part of God's plan. God wasn't absent through any of it. God was orchestrating all of it. Think about Joseph again. Sold into slavery, falsely imprisoned, years of suffering. But when Joseph finally understood the bigger picture, he said to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50 verse 20. Every single difficult thing, it had a purpose. It was all working together toward something God was always planning. That's where you are right now. In this moment, looking back, you can finally see it. All of it, the struggle, the silence, the pain, the transformation, it was all God moving you toward your purpose. You didn't end up here by accident. You didn't survive the silence because you were strong enough. You made it through because God was orchestrating it. God was guiding it. God was in it. This is the deepest understanding. God's plan isn't just good. God's plan is perfect. Not because nothing bad happened, but because God took everything, even the bad, and wove it into something that ultimately serves your growth and God's purpose. When you finally understand this, several things happen. First, you stop blaming God. You stop asking, "Why did you abandon me?" because you finally see that God was never absent. Second, you stop doubting God. Because if God was faithful through that, God is faithful through anything. Third, you stop resisting God's plan. Because you realize that God's plan is actually better than your plan. God's way is actually more fulfilling than your way. And fourth, you start trusting God in ways you never have before. Because you have proof. You have evidence. You have your own story of God's faithfulness. This is the promise of Isaiah 55, verses 8 to 9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's way is higher. God's plan is bigger. God's purpose is more than you could have planned for yourself. And when God felt far away, that wasn't God leaving you. That was God preparing you for what comes next. You're not the same person who started this journey. You're not in the same place spiritually. You don't have the same faith. You've been transformed. And that transformation, it's evidence that God was never far away. God was right beside you the entire time, closer than your own heartbeat, orchestrating something so beautiful that it required your complete, absolute trust to see it unfold. And now that you see it, now that you finally understand, you can never go back. You can never doubt God's faithfulness again, because you've lived it. You've walked through it. You've become it. God was never far away. God is right here, right now. And God's plan for your life is more perfect than you could have ever imagined. If this message spoke to you today, if you recognized yourself in any of these 12 signs of God's perfect faithfulness, then understand something. God has never been far away. Not in the silence. Not in the struggle. Not in the darkness. Not in the season where you felt most abandoned. God has been right there, closer than your own thoughts, orchestrating something so beautiful, so perfect, so purposeful that it required your absolute faith to unfold. The distance you felt wasn't real. It was your perception, not your reality. And now, looking back, you can see it. You can feel it. You can know it. God was never far away. God was always right beside you. And if you're still in the silence right now, if God still feels far away, know this: God is already working on something beautiful for you. God is already preparing you. God is already orchestrating your story toward something perfect. You don't have to see it. You don't have to feel it. You just have to trust it. Here's what I need you to do. If this message reached your heart, if you felt God speaking to you through these 12 signs, type in the comments, "God, I see your faithfulness now." 7 words that change everything. Let me know that you're ready to trust God's perfect plan, even in the silence. And then, please, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone in their silence. Someone who feels abandoned. Someone who's forgotten that God's faithfulness is perfect, even when we can't see it. Because the world needs to know, God doesn't feel far away. God is right beside you. And when you finally see the signs, you'll understand that He's been there all along, orchestrating something more perfect than you could have ever imagined. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next message. Hit the notification bell. Join our community of people who are learning to see God's faithfulness everywhere. Your breakthrough is coming. God's plan is perfect. Trust the silence. God bless you. I'll see you in the comments. Amen. When God feels far away, you're waiting for a big sign. A dramatic answer to prayer. A miraculous intervention. A sudden shift in circumstances. A moment where you feel God's presence unmistakably. You're watching for the lightning bolt. You're waiting for the burning bush. You're looking for something so obvious that you couldn't miss it. And while you're watching for the big sign, you're completely missing the small ones. This is the 10th sign. And it's about learning to recognize God's movement in the ordinary. Listen to what happened with Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Elijah was in the wilderness, exhausted, feeling abandoned by God. And God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before me, for the Lord is about to pass by." So Elijah went out. And he waited for the big sign. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then came a gentle whisper. That's where God was. Not in the dramatic. Not in the obvious. But in the gentle whisper. When God feels far away, He might be moving in ways so gentle that you're missing them because you're looking for something louder. You'll notice this when you start paying attention. When you start asking, "Wait, is that God?" When you realize that the friend who called at exactly the right time, that might be God. The opportunity that came out of nowhere, that might be God. The thought that just occurred to you that changed your perspective, that might be God moving. God isn't waiting for you to notice the big things. God is showing up in the small things all the time. Every day. Multiple times a day. But you're looking past them because they're not dramatic enough. You're waiting for a vision. God is sending a friend. You're waiting for an angel. God is providing through an unexpected source. You're waiting for a miracle. God is working through coincidence, which is just God's way of staying anonymous. Here's the truth. God is more active in your life right now than He's ever been. But you can't see it because you're looking in the wrong direction. Start paying attention to the small things. The right conversation at the right time. The book you picked up that had exactly the answer you needed. The person who said the thing that changed your perspective. The door that opened when you didn't even knock. the burden that lifted when you weren't looking, the provision that appeared without explanation. That's God moving. When you finally start seeing these small signs, something shifts. The silence doesn't feel so loud anymore. The distance doesn't feel so far. Because you're realizing that God has been answering all along, you just weren't looking for the kind of answers God was giving. This is the moment when you realize, God isn't far away. God is surrounding you with evidence of His presence. You just have to have eyes to see it. But there's something even deeper happening now. As you start to see God's movement everywhere, you realize something about yourself. You're not the same person you were when God first felt far away. And not just spiritually, you're literally different. And that's when the 11th sign emerges. You realize that you're becoming someone new. Look back at who you were before God felt far away. That person had certainty. That person felt God's presence. That person had answers. That person knew things. But look at who you are now. You have humility. You have compassion for others in their doubt. You have faith that doesn't depend on feelings. You have wisdom that comes from having walked through darkness. You have strength that only comes from having been tested. This is the 11th sign. And it's the evidence that God has been building you into someone greater than you were before. Listen to what 1 Peter 1 verses 6-7 says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." Your faith is being refined like gold in fire. And the result is faith that's more valuable than gold. Not because it feels good, but because it's been tested and found genuine. The person you were before couldn't have become this person without the silence, without the struggle, without the feeling of God's distance. You needed to be broken down so you could be rebuilt into someone stronger. You'll see this in how you respond to things now. That situation that would have destroyed you before, you handle it with grace now. That person you would have judged before, you understand them now. That fear that would have paralyzed you before, you walk through it now. You're not the same person. And you're better for it. This is what the Bible means when it talks about being born again. It doesn't just mean becoming a Christian. It means becoming a new person. The old is gone. The new has come. And the new you is someone God couldn't have created through comfort. God could only create this you through struggle. God didn't make you weak. God made you real. God didn't abandon you. God refined you. God wasn't far away. God was inside the crucible with you, transforming you into someone with integrity, depth, and unshakable faith. And here's the beautiful part. This new you can't go back. You can't unknow what you now know. You can't unbecome who you've become. The silence changed you permanently, for the better. But there's something even more profound happening now. As you recognize how fundamentally changed you are, you realize something. This entire journey, from feeling far from God to becoming this new person, it's been orchestrated. It's been planned. It's been perfect. And that's when the 12th and final sign emerges, the moment you finally understand that God's been working perfectly the entire time. There's a strange thing that happens when God feels far away for long enough. You stop praying. Not consciously, maybe. But gradually, your prayers become fewer. They become more desperate. They become less about conversation and more about pleading. And eventually, some prayers just stop. You stop asking because you've learned to expect no. You stop hoping because disappointment hurts too much. You stop reaching because your arm is tired. So you give up on certain prayers. You release them. You decide, God isn't going to answer this one, so I'm just going to accept it and move on. And then, after you've stopped asking, God answers. This is the 8th sign, and it's one of the most surprising revelations about God's timing and faithfulness. Listen to what happened with Abraham. He and Sarah prayed for a child for years. Decades, actually. And after waiting so long that it became impossible, Sarah was past childbearing age, they stopped praying for it. They accepted it would never happen. They released the prayer. And then God gave them Isaac. Not when they were desperately asking. Not when they were at their most faithful in prayer. But after they'd surrendered. After they'd let go. After they'd accepted that God's answer was no. When God feels far away, sometimes He waits until you've stopped demanding an answer so He can give you the answer He always had in mind. You'll notice this when you finally look back at your life. That dream you gave up on, that relationship you released, that prayer you stopped praying because it hurt too much to keep hoping. Look at it now. Look at how God is actually addressing it, just not on your timeline and not in the way you expected. Sometimes God waits until you're ready to receive the answer. Sometimes He waits until you've grown enough to handle what you asked for. Sometimes He waits until you've surrendered enough to appreciate it. Because here's the truth. God isn't ignoring your prayers. God is timing them. The Bible says in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Not beautiful when you want it, but beautiful in its time. God's timing. God's rhythm. God's perfect orchestration of when you'll be ready. When you stopped praying that prayer, you didn't lose it. God caught it. God held it. God has been working on making it real in the way that's best for you. This is why the silence doesn't mean God isn't listening. The silence might mean God is listening perfectly, and waiting for exactly the right moment to move. But there's something even deeper happening now. As you realize that God is answering prayers you'd stopped praying, you start to wonder about other prayers. Prayers you are still praying. Prayers that still feel unanswered. And that's when the 9th sign emerges. You realize that God is also working on those, even in the silence. When God feels far away, you're not just waiting for an answer. You're being prepared for something so much bigger than what you asked for that, if God gave it to you now, it would actually hurt you instead of help you. This is the 9th sign. And it's the moment when you stop asking, why isn't God answering? And start asking, what is God preparing me for? Listen to what happened with Moses. Moses asked God to let him into the promised land. It seemed like a reasonable prayer, right? Moses had been faithful his entire life. He'd led God's people through the wilderness for 40 years. If anyone deserved to enter the promised land, it was Moses. But God said no. And Moses died before entering the promised land. From a surface level, it seems cruel. It seems like God abandoned Moses at the finish line. But here's what Moses didn't know. God was preparing something greater. God was preparing Moses to lead the people into the promised land from beyond the veil, to be a spiritual leader whose influence would outlast his physical life. Moses' faithfulness in the wilderness became the foundation for everything that came after. If God had given Moses what he asked for, Moses would have had a good life. But because God didn't give him that, Moses got something infinitely greater, eternal significance. When God feels far away and doesn't answer your prayer the way you asked, it's often because He's preparing you for something bigger than what you asked for. Something that requires you to be different than you are now. Something that requires the faith you're developing in the silence. You'll notice this when you finally understand. The very thing you're not getting is what's freeing you to receive something greater. You didn't get that relationship, and later you realized it would have held you back from your purpose. You didn't get that job, and the one you did get actually aligned with your calling. You didn't get the easy way out, and the hard path actually made you who you were meant to become. God doesn't say no to be mean. God says no to redirect you toward something yes. This is what 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 means when Paul talks about God's grace being sufficient. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God isn't giving you what you asked for. God is giving you what you need, which is often something completely different. When you finally understand this, when you finally see that the silence and the unanswered prayers are actually God's yes to something greater, you stop fighting God's timing. You stop demanding answers. You start trusting the preparation. And here's what happens when you trust the preparation. You realize you're not waiting anymore. You're not stuck. You're becoming. You're growing into the person you need to be for the next chapter of your life. The silence isn't a holding pattern. It's a gymnasium. God is building muscle you didn't know you needed. God is developing strength you didn't know you had. But there's something even more profound happening now. As you start to trust that God is preparing something greater, you begin to see evidence of it everywhere. Small confirmations, divine appointments, doors opening. And that's when the 10th sign emerges. You realize that God is actively moving in your life right now. During the silence, during the time when God felt far away, that's when you were being transformed. The Bible describes it this way in Romans 5 verses 3-4. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Suffering, perseverance, character, hope. It's a progression. You can't skip steps. You have to go through the suffering, through the silence, through the feeling of God's absence. And that process is what builds you. God isn't far away. God is in the transformation. God is in the crucible. God is in the fire that's burning away everything that isn't essential in you. You're not the same person because God has been working you like a sculptor works marble, removing what doesn't belong, shaping you into something beautiful, something strong, something real. And here's what's beautiful. You can see this transformation. You can point to specific ways you're different. You're kinder. You're braver. You're more honest. You're more humble. You're more yourself than you've ever been. That's not nothing. That's everything. That's the proof that God has been present throughout. The silence wasn't absence. It was incubation. The distance wasn't abandonment. It was development. The feeling that God was far away, that was the moment God was closest, inside you, reshaping you, making you into who you were meant to become. But there's something even deeper happening now. As you recognize how much you've changed, you start to understand something about God's faithfulness. You start to see that this whole journey, the silence, the struggle, the transformation, it's all been orchestrated by God. And that's when the 7th sign emerges, the moment you realize God's faithfulness has been perfect all along. This is the moment when everything clicks, when you finally see it, really see it. The silence wasn't God's failure. The distance wasn't His abandonment. The struggle wasn't His cruelty. All of it was God's perfect faithfulness unfolding in exactly the way you needed it to unfold. This is the 7th and final sign. And it's the one that changes everything about how you understand God. Listen to what Psalm 31 verse 21 says, "Praise be to the Lord, for He showed me the wonders of His love when I was in a city under siege." Notice, when I was in a city under siege. Not after. Not looking back from safety. But in the middle of it. God showed His love right there in the difficulty. When God feels far away, He's actually showing you His faithfulness most clearly. But you can't see it in the moment. You have to trust it. You have to believe it. And then, as time passes, you look back and you finally see what God was doing. Think about Joseph again. Betrayed by his brothers. Sold into slavery. Falsely accused. Imprisoned. For years, Joseph could have thought, God has abandoned me. God is far away. This is not how a faithful God acts. But Joseph didn't give up. Joseph didn't stop trusting. And then, when the time was right, God brought Joseph to a position where he could save his entire nation. And Joseph said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50 verse 20. All of it, the betrayal, the slavery, the imprisonment, it was all part of God's perfect plan. God wasn't far away. God was orchestrating something Joseph couldn't have imagined. When God feels far away, that's exactly what He might be doing. He might be orchestrating something so far beyond your ability to imagine that He needs your faith to go into the silence. He needs you to trust without seeing. You'll understand this when you look back at your own story. The worst season of your life. Look at what God built through it. The time you felt most abandoned. Look at how God was actually protecting you from something worse. The silence that seemed endless. Look at what God was preparing you for. Your faithfulness in the silence was exactly what God needed from you to move you into your purpose. This is the deepest truth. God's faithfulness isn't measured by how good your life is. It's measured by how faithful God is to His purpose for your life. And sometimes His purpose requires silence. Sometimes it requires struggle. Sometimes it requires the kind of faith that says, "I don't understand, but I trust you anyway." And that kind of faith, that's what changes the world. That's what creates saints. That's what transforms ordinary people into people who can move mountains. When God feels far away, He's closer than He's ever been. He's closer because He's inside you, building you, shaping you, preparing you for something that requires the strength you're developing right now. The silence isn't punishment. It's incubation. The distance isn't rejection. It's direction. The darkness isn't God's absence. It's God's presence in its most powerful form, the form that requires your absolute, unwavering trust. And when you finally understand this, when you finally see how perfectly faithful God has been throughout, something shifts inside you. You're not waiting for God to show up anymore. You know He's here. You know He's been here. You know He'll be here. That's the faith that doesn't move. That's the peace that surpasses understanding. That's the certainty that no circumstance can shake. God was never far away. You were just being prepared to understand what it means to be loved by a God who's faithful even in silence. Think about a tree. A tree that grows in perfect conditions. No storms, no wind, no struggle, stays shallow-rooted. But a tree that struggles against the wind? Its roots grow deeper. Its trunk becomes stronger. The very difficulty is what's building strength. When God feels far away, you're in the struggle. And your faith is growing roots. You'll notice this when you look back. The times you felt closest to God, they weren't always the good times. Sometimes they were the times you had to trust without feeling. The times you prayed even though you didn't believe. The times you showed up even though you wanted to give up. Those times built your faith. Your faith isn't failing. It's maturing. It's moving from a faith that depends on feelings to a faith that depends on trust. And that's an exponentially stronger faith. Real faith doesn't say, "I feel God, so I believe." Real faith says, "I don't feel God, but I believe anyway." That's the kind of faith that changes the world. That's the kind of faith that moves mountains, not because you're stronger, but because you're trusting in something stronger than yourself. You're not weak because God feels far away. You're becoming unshakable. Because when you've learned to trust God in silence, what could possibly shake you? When you've walked through darkness and still believed, what earthly circumstance could destroy your faith? When you felt abandoned and still showed up, nothing can stop you. This is the refinement process. This is God building you into the person you need to become. Not by making things easy, but by asking you to trust when it's hard. But here's what happens next. As your faith deepens, you start to notice something in your circumstances. You start to see that things are actually changing, not in the way you expected, but in the way you needed. And that's when the fifth sign emerges. God is working in ways you're finally starting to recognize. When God feels far away, you assume He's not answering your prayers. You prayed for healing and the sickness continued. You prayed for the relationship to be restored and it fell apart anyway. You prayed for the job and someone else got it. You prayed for relief and the burden only got heavier. So you conclude, God didn't answer. God said no. God isn't listening. But what if God is answering, just not in the way you prayed? This is the fifth sign, and it reveals something profound about how God actually works in our lives. Listen to what Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, the night before His crucifixion. He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22 verse 42. Jesus was asking God to spare Him, to take away the suffering, to give Him the easy way out. God didn't answer that prayer the way Jesus asked. Instead, God led Jesus through the crucifixion, through suffering, death, and resurrection. God said no to Jesus's request. But God answered Jesus's deeper prayer, His prayer to serve God's purpose. And that no to the surface prayer became the greatest yes to the deeper prayer. Because through that suffering, Jesus saved the world. When God feels far away and doesn't answer your prayers the way you asked, it's often because He's answering your deeper prayers. The ones you didn't even know you were praying. The prayers of your heart that go beyond your circumstances. You'll notice this when you look back. That healing you didn't get, but you found strength in the illness that you never would have discovered otherwise. That relationship that fell apart, but it freed you from something that wasn't good for you. That job you didn't get, but it opened a door to something better. That burden that didn't go away, but it connected you to people and purposes you never would have found in ease. God was answering, just not the surface prayer, the deeper prayer. Here's what's crucial. God doesn't just give you what you ask for. He gives you what you need. And sometimes those are completely different things. You're praying, "Take away this pain." But God's praying with you, "Use this pain to build character. Use this struggle to create compassion. Use this difficulty to develop strength." It's not that God doesn't care about your surface prayer. It's that God loves you too much to give you only what you asked for. God loves you enough to give you what will actually change your life. When you finally see this, when you finally recognize that God has been answering your prayers, just in ways you didn't expect, the silence starts to feel different. It starts to feel like wisdom. Like God saying, "Trust me. I see further than you do. I see what you need more than you do." But there's something even more important happening now. As you start to trust God's wisdom about your prayers, you realize something about yourself. You're not the same person you were before this silence. You've changed. And that change is evidence that God has been present all along. And that's when the sixth sign emerges. You realize that you're not who you used to be. When God feels far away, you focus on what hasn't changed. Your circumstances are still hard. Your prayers are still unanswered. The silence is still deafening. So you think, nothing has changed. God is absent. Time has just passed. But if you look deeper, if you actually examine your own heart, you'll notice something. You've changed. This is the sixth sign. And it's the most personal evidence that God has been working in you all along. Listen to what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 17. "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here." Paul isn't saying your circumstances become new. He's saying you become new. Not because you tried harder, but because God was working in you. When God feels far away and you're walking through silence, God is actually doing His deepest work, the work of changing you from the inside out. Think about it. The person you were before this season, would that person have the patience you have now? Would they have the compassion? Would they have the resilience, the faith, the humility? Or were those things built in you during the silence? You'll notice this when you encounter a situation that would have destroyed you before. But now you handle it with grace, with wisdom, with trust. And you think, when did I become this person? Your spouse saying the right thing at the right time? God was working. That opportunity that came out of nowhere. God was working. The fact that you made it through something you thought would destroy you. God was already there. The silence you interpreted as absence was actually God working quietly, faithfully, without needing credit. That's the kind of love God has. He doesn't need you to see it to be real. He doesn't need you to feel it to be true. He just keeps working. He keeps providing. He keeps protecting. He keeps showing up in the small, mundane, ordinary moments that make up your actual life. When you finally start noticing these small works, something shifts inside you. The silence doesn't feel like abandonment anymore. It feels like trust. Like God saying, I don't need you to feel my presence. Just look around. I'm here. But there's something even more profound happening now. As you start seeing God's small works, you realize you're not the only one experiencing this. Other people are in the silence too. And that's when the third sign emerges. You start to see that everyone is carrying doubt. When God feels far away, you feel alone. Alone in your doubt. Alone in your silence. Alone in your questioning. You look at other people and think they must have it all figured out. They must feel God's presence. They must have stronger faith. They must not be struggling like you are. So you hide. You pretend. You put on the mask of someone who has it all together. Because admitting that God feels far away, that feels like failure. That feels like weakness. That feels like you're the only one. But here's the truth. You're not. This is the third sign. And it's profoundly comforting if you let it be. Listen to what the psalmist wrote. Over and over again, in the Psalms, you'll find people expressing doubt, fear, and abandonment. Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? This isn't written by someone with weak faith. This is written by King David, a man of God. And even he felt abandoned by God. If King David could feel this way, maybe it's not weakness. Maybe it's part of being human. When God feels far away, almost everyone feels it, they just don't talk about it. Your pastor might be questioning. Your friend with a perfect faith might be silently struggling. The person who seems to have it all together, they probably feel far from God too. And here's the beautiful part. When you finally admit it, you give others permission to admit it too. You'll notice this when you start being honest. When you say out loud, I don't understand God right now. He feels far away. Watch what happens. Other people open up. They confess their own doubts. They admit their own struggles. And suddenly, you're not alone anymore. This is what Jesus did. He didn't surround himself with people who had perfect faith. He surrounded himself with doubters, questioners, and the broken. Thomas doubted the resurrection. Peter denied knowing Jesus. The disciples constantly misunderstood. But Jesus loved them anyway. In fact, he loved them especially in their doubt. Because doubt isn't the opposite of faith. Honest doubt is actually deeper faith than pretend certainty. Real faith says, I don't understand, and it's terrifying, but I'm still here. I'm still trusting. I'm still showing up. When you finally admit that God feels far away, you join the human race. You join every saint who's ever lived, everyone from David to Job to the disciples to countless millions who've walked this earth in silence, questioning, doubting, but not giving up. And here's what happens when you stop pretending and start being honest. You create space for real connection. real community, real faith that isn't based on feelings but on shared struggle. But there's something even deeper happening now. As you connect with others in their doubt, you start to realize something about yourself. You're stronger than you thought. The very struggle that felt like abandonment is actually building something in you. And that's when the fourth sign appears. You realize that God's distance is actually developing your strength. When God feels far away, your first instinct is to think your faith is failing. That the silence means you're losing God. That the distance means you're moving away. That the doubt means you're getting weaker in your belief. So you panic. You try harder to feel God's presence. You pray more frantically. You read the Bible more desperately. You're trying to get back to that place where you felt close to Him. But here's what you don't realize. The very struggle you're experiencing is building your faith into something stronger than it's ever been. This is the fourth sign. And it's counterintuitive because weakness doesn't feel like strength. Listen to what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12 verses 9 to 10. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul is saying something radical. Weakness is where strength lives. Not in confidence, not in certainty, but in vulnerability. If God feels far away right now, watch this until the end, because what you're about to discover might just change everything. We've all been there. That place where heaven feels silent, where your prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling, where you look around and think, "God, where are you? Why do you feel so distant?" Maybe you've prayed for months and nothing changed. Maybe you've begged for help and felt abandoned. Maybe you've cried out in the darkness and heard only echoes. And so you started to wonder, has God forgotten me? Has He left me? Am I alone in this? But here's what most people don't realize. The distance you feel is not always the distance that exists. Today, we're uncovering 7 unmistakable signs that reveal God is actually closer than you've ever been, even when it feels like He's a million miles away. And I'm not talking about empty platitudes or false comfort. I'm talking about the real presence of God. The kind that shows up in ways you can recognize. The kind that proves He's been beside you all along. Some of these signs will shock you. Some might make you cry. But the last one might reveal something you've never realized about God's faithfulness. Stay until the end. When God feels far away, the first thing you notice is the silence. No answer to your prayers. No sense of His presence. No feeling of comfort or guidance. Just quiet. And that silence can feel like the loudest rejection. It can feel like abandonment. It can feel like proof that God isn't there, or worse, that He doesn't care. But here's what happens when you stop running from the silence and start listening to it. You realize the silence itself is a message. This is the first sign. And it's counterintuitive because silence feels like absence. But sometimes, silence is actually God's way of deepening your faith. Sometimes, quiet is how God teaches you to trust without feeling. Sometimes, the absence of His presence is actually the presence of His refining work. Listen to what happened with Job. He suffered terribly, lost everything, and his friends came and talked about God endlessly. But Job himself, Job was silent. He didn't understand. He couldn't feel God's presence. He was in the darkness. But God's silence during that season wasn't abandonment. It was testing. It was refining. It was preparing Job for something greater than he could have imagined. Psalm 23 verse 4 says, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Notice, the darkest valley. Not a bright meadow. Not a place where you feel close to God. But a dark place. A place where you might feel abandoned. Yet the promise is, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. When God feels far away, his silence doesn't mean he's absent. It means he's testing whether you'll trust him without the feeling. This is the deepest kind of faith. Not faith that feels good. Not faith that comes with confirmation and signs and warm feelings. But faith that persists even in silence. Faith that says, I don't feel you, but I believe you're here. You'll notice this in your own experience. There are moments when you felt closest to God, not because he suddenly showed up with thunder and lightning, but because you chose to believe he was there even though you couldn't feel him. Those moments of silent trust, that's when your faith actually grows. The silence isn't punishment. It's invitation. It's God inviting you into a deeper relationship, one that doesn't depend on feelings. One that depends on trust. Here's what's radical. God doesn't need to shout for you to hear him. Sometimes he whispers. Sometimes he's silent. And in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear the most important message, I'm still here. Trust me. But here's what happens next. As you learn to trust in the silence, you start to notice something else. You start to see that God has been working all along. You just weren't looking in the right place. And that's when the second sign appears. When God feels far away, it's easy to assume he's doing nothing. You're looking for the dramatic, the miracle, the answered prayer, the sudden shift in circumstances. You're waiting for God to move mountains. But meanwhile, life keeps happening. Bills get paid. Relationships continue. Days pass. And none of it feels miraculous. None of it feels like God working. But what if God's presence isn't always dramatic? What if he's actually most active in the ordinary? This is the second sign. And it reveals something profound about how God actually works in our lives. Listen to what happened with Jesus' disciples. They were constantly looking for signs, for proof of Jesus' power. But Jesus was already there, with them, doing the most important work of all, teaching, loving, being present. Not performing magic. Not doing the flashy thing. Just being faithful in the small moments. Zechariah 4 verse 10 asks, Who despises the day of small things? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is, most of us do. We despise small things. We overlook them. We're waiting for the big miracle, so we miss the small faithfulness. When God feels far away, it's often because you're not seeing what he's doing. Think about your life right now. Yes, some prayers are still unanswered. Yes, some circumstances haven't changed. But look closer. Who provided the money for that unexpected bill? Who brought that friend into your life right when you needed someone? Who gave you the strength to get out of bed on the day you wanted to give up? Who protected you from something you didn't even know was coming? That's God working. Not always dramatically, but faithfully. Not always in the way you prayed, but in the way you needed. You'll notice this when you actually start paying attention. When you start asking, wait, how did that happen? When you realize that the reason you're alive right now is because God has been working behind the scenes in 1,000 small ways that you took for granted.